Hi, I'm Marika from My Creative Quilts, and a couple of weeks ago I showed you how to put a binding on a quilt, which is this, for people who don't know. And it's the piece of fabric that folds, that finishes your quilt. It hides the raw edges and it gives it a finished edge. But sometimes you have a quilt or a wall hanging that you don't want to put a binding on, either because you think it might take away from the visual impact of the quilt, or you just can't find the right binding for the quilt. And in that case, you can put on a facing. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do today. Facings are not any more difficult than putting on a binding. And in fact, some people find them a bit easier because you're not having to worry about mitered corners. Just a couple of extra little tiny steps, but it can have a really great impact on the quilt. So let me show you how to do it. So I didn't know anything about facings until a couple of years ago when I took the Ricky Tim's workshop luminarium. But I wonder sometimes now, if I'd known about facings, if I might have put a facing on this wall hanging instead of the binding. But I do like the binding. I think it finishes it off. So this is one wall hanging where you would want the binding. Now here's one that I'm working on. I haven't quilted it yet, so I haven't decided. If I do put a binding on it, it'll probably be the same as this inner border. But I might put a facing instead if I don't want it to be obvious. I'm not sure. Now, a quilt that I just finished called my Zoo Family Portrait Quilt. I don't like the idea of putting a binding on it because there's just so much going on that I can't find a good binding that will really go around it well. So I've decided to face it. And I'm going to show you how to do it. I'm going to skip all the sewing part because you know how to sew. I'm just going to show you the steps. So I decided to use the same fabric as the background for the backing for this, for the facing for this quilt. Now normally I would use the same fabric as the backing, but I don't know if you can see it, but this is a graduated fabric. It's an ombre fabric, and I can't match a facing to the changing colors, and that would drive me crazy. So, and the other thing I'd be concerned about is if I'm not 100% accurate and some of the facing peeks out, I don't want it to be dark. I want it to be the same as this. So that's what I'm going to use. Now you start the same way as you would for a binding. You're going to cut your strips. Now for a wall hanging, I would do the regular 2 inches, 2¼ inches maybe, but this is a big quilt. It's a 60 by 85 quilt or something like that. So I want a wider binding just for a bit more sturdiness. So you cut your strips, and I cut out 3-inch strips for this project. So I have my 3-inch strips that I cut out, and I folded them in half, just as I would for a binding. Press it well. You want a really crisp edge to be able to sew down the facing at the end. But instead of one long continuous binding, you cut out 4 strips equal to the length, 2 for the length and 2 for the width of the quilt, because we're not turning at the corners, and you're going to see why in a minute. If you're going to join them because your fabric isn't long enough, I suggest you still do the diagonal join like you would with a binding, because otherwise you're going to get too thick seam bumps when you're sewing down your facing. So once you've cut out your strips, then you cut out 4 squares. Now, because it's a wider binding, I cut out 5-inch squares. If you're doing smaller, or facing, sorry, if you're doing a smaller facing, you might do a 4-inch square. You take your 5-inch squares, you want 4, 1 for each corner, and you fold them into a triangle and you press them in half like this. So you want to have 4 triangles, 1 for each corner of the quilt. Okay, so you take the first of your 4 triangles and you put it on the corner. Now don't forget, this technique you're using the front of the quilt because you're going to flip it to the back, just like you would do if you were going to hand sew the binding down. So on the front of the quilt, you take the first corner that you've cut and you either pin it or clip it, or whatever your preferred method is. Then you take the first strip and you want to start it about halfway down the triangle. Now, you don't want it too far off to the side because when you flip it, this is going to show, and you also don't want it too far there because then it's going to get too thick and bulky. So about halfway down, you have your raw edges against raw edges, and you're going to clip this down or pin it down, or however you prefer. Smaller pieces I don't bother pinning, but big ones like this quilt, definitely, because so much can go wrong. So I'm just going to clip it all the way across and then show you what to do when you get to the next corner. Okay, so now I've clipped down most of the strip and I've clipped down the opposing, if you want to call it that, triangle. I always cut my strips for my facings longer than they should be because I've had too many times where I've just been a little bit too short. So I always make sure I give myself some extra space. So what I'm going to do now is sort of eyeball it. That's about halfway. And I'm going to trim it now. Now I know that my facing is the right length. So I'm just going to finish pinning it down. And then I'm going to sew it down. And I'm going to repeat the process all across. And I'll come back to you and show you what the next step is. And I'm back. I have sewn down all 4 sides, the strips. I used a 1/4 inch seam. Some people ask if they can serge or they can zigzag. It's up to them. They can if they want. I don't, but some people do. That's not a problem. I cut off the corner. I clipped the corner of the corner, and I'm going to do that on all 4 sides, and that's because we're going to be turning this around. We want to be able to make a nice sharp corner there. So the next step is I'm going to take this to my ironing board and I'm going to press down the seams to make it easier to turn it over. Now, it's very important that you know what kind of batting you have, because if you're using a wool batting, for example, you can't use steam, or you shouldn't use steam because you could end up inadvertently felting the batting. This is bamboo, so I'm not to put too much heat on it, but I can do it on the edge if I'm careful. I'm just going to be very careful. Once that's done, some people like to stitch in the ditch to make sure it's a really clean thing. I'm not going to for this particular quilt simply because there are so many colors and I am not particularly good at stitching the ditch. I tend to wander no matter how careful I am, and I don't want other color threads interfering. So I'm going to skip that step here. But for another one where the color of the thread isn't that important, I would definitely do that. So now, like I said, I'm going to clip my corners. I'm going to press down my facings. And if I was going to, then I would stitch in the ditch, but I'm not going to do that for this particular one. So I'm going to go press it and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've pressed open the facings, and now I want to flip over the triangles. I like to use a bamboo presser. I like this tool. It's great for it if you're not doing a good enough job finger pressing. You can use it for that, and you can use the point for turning corners fairly safely. So I'm going to take my triangle, which I've clip the edge off, and I'm just going to use my bamboo pointer to gently, but not too gently, because you do need to push a little bit, push that into as sharp a corner as I possibly can. There we go. And we have our corner. I'm going to do that for all 4 corners. Now the other thing I have to do is prepare my label. So this is the bottom of the quilt, and I have made my label. I have finished off the edges here. This is how I make my labels. I do I make it either into a square or a triangle, rectangle. I fold over the corner, press it, fold the top, fold the side, and then I tuck it into the corner. Now I made it especially big on the bottom because I wanted to make sure it would fit in the triangle without cutting off the words. So I am going to cut it to about here, and that it will nestle in nicely. I'll probably take about 1 inch off of the edge there, and then the label will fit there nicely. So I'm going to go and turn all my corners. Then, usually when I'm binding, I don't clip, but because I want I want it tightly pulled over, I am going to clip it all around, and then I'm going to sew it by hand, and your facing is done. Now, if this is a wall hanging or a small quilt that I want to hang on the wall, I won't sew close the top 2 triangles because you can use them. You can put they hold the dowels to hang up your quilt. So if you would like to see what this quilt looks like, I'm going to put the URL in the description of this video. It's called the Zoo Family Quilt. I'm very, very happy with it. And anyway, I hope this facing video was helpful to you, and I will see you next time.